The morning Jack Rodriguez's life changed forever began like any other gig day in Lower Manhattan. His vintage Fender Stratocaster, a well-worn companion rescued from a pawn shop years ago, hung loose around his neck as he set up his usual spot near the Charging Bull statue. Street performers knew this location well. Tourists, financial workers, and the occasional curious local formed a steady stream of potential audience members. At precisely 9:17 a.m., the first sign of something extraordinary occurred. A harmonic resonance, too low to be heard, but viscerally felt, swept through the financial district. Jack's fingers, mid-chord, froze. The strings of his guitar vibrated with an impossible frequency, creating a sound that wasn't quite music, wasn't quite language, but something entirely in between. Around him, smartphone screens flickered. Smartwatches went blank. The massive digital billboards in Times Square dissolved into a complex, shifting pattern of geometric shapes that seemed to breathe with an alien intelligence. 17 vessels materialized above the world's major cities simultaneously. They weren't the metallic, weapon-laden spaceships of countless sci-fi movies. These were quantum sculptures, structures that seemed to exist between solid matter and pure energy. In New York, the vessel above Manhattan looked like a massive liquid mercury origami, constantly folding and unfolding in mathematically perfect sequences. Jack felt something change in the air. The guitar around his neck wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was vibrating with a purpose he couldn't yet understand. Simultaneously, in a hidden complex beneath the Rocky Mountains, Dr. Aria Chen received the first official alert. Her quantum linguistics team had been preparing for this moment their entire careers, though most of humanity had dismissed their work as academic fantasy. Chen was a third-generation scientist. Her grandparents had been part of the early SETI programs. Her parents had developed advanced communication protocols for potential extraterrestrial contact. "It's happening," she whispered into her encrypted communication device, her voice a blend of professional calm and barely contained excitement. The global response was unlike anything in human history. There was no panic, no immediate military mobilization. Years of international cooperation protocols, developed through climate crisis management and global pandemic responses, kicked into gear with surgical precision. Within 30 minutes, a unified global communication network was established, drawing experts from every conceivable field. Back on the street, Jack noticed something strange. The complex patterns on the nearby digital billboards seemed to pulse in rhythm with the notes he was unconsciously playing. When he shifted his hand, the patterns changed. When he struck a particular chord, the alien vessel above seemed to shimmer, its liquid-like surface rippling with synchronous energy. At the United Nations emergency session, representatives from 193 countries watched in collective wonderment. The 17 vessels made no aggressive moves. They simply existed, presence without threat, complexity without explanation. Dr. Chen's team began analyzing the initial data streams. The alien transmission was unlike any communication protocol ever encountered. It wasn't a language in the traditional sense. It was a living, adaptive system that seemed to respond and morph based on how humans attempted to interpret it. "It's not a message," Chen told her team, studying the rapidly changing quantum signatures. "It's an invitation, and I think we're just beginning to understand what that means." As the first hours of first contact unfolded, humanity stood at the precipice of its greatest adventure. The street musician in Manhattan, the quantum linguists in their underground facility, the diplomats in their emergency sessions, all were about to discover that the universe was far more extraordinary than they had ever imagined. The silent descent had begun. The first complete fragment of the alien transmission arrived at the International Quantum Research Center in Geneva, Switzerland, carried not by digital signal, but by an impossible medium that defied current scientific understanding. Dr. Aria Chen stared at the holographic representation, her fingers tracing the complex, three-dimensional pattern that seemed to shift and breathe with its own form of intelligence. "It's alive," whispered Dr. Mikhail Sokolov, her lead quantum physicist. The transmission wasn't a static message, but a dynamic, evolving system of information that responded to human observation. Meanwhile, in a small apartment in Mumbai, 16-year-old Priya Merchant was doing something unprecedented. Her open-source collaborative platform, initially designed as a high school computer science project, had become the unexpected epicenter of global communication decryption. Thousands of volunteers from around the world were working simultaneously, each contributing microscopic pieces to an incomprehensible puzzle. Back in Manhattan, Jack Rodriguez discovered something strange about his guitar. The instrument seemed to resonate with the alien transmission in ways no scientific instrument could measure. When he played certain chord progressions, digital screens around him would momentarily display fragments of the alien communication, complex mathematical sequences that looked like a hybrid between musical notation and quantum equations. The global scientific community quickly realized this wasn't a traditional first contact scenario. Each major world government had received a different fragment of the transmission, forcing an unprecedented level of international collaboration. The United States had received a segment focused on complex quantum entanglement. China's fragment appeared to contain biological adaptation algorithms. Brazil's portion seemed to be related to ecological systems integration. Dr. Chen's team worked around the clock, developing new computational models just to begin understanding the transmission's basic structure. "This isn't a message," she told a closed-door session of international scientific leaders. "This is a living system of communication that actively adapts to our attempts to understand it." Unexpected connections began to emerge. A group of ethnomusicologists discovered that indigenous musical traditions from around the world seemed to contain harmonic structures remarkably similar to fragments of the alien transmission. In Peru, Quechua musicians found their traditional panpipe compositions resonated with specific quantum signatures detected in the transmission. The most bizarre developments centered on Jack Rodriguez. Intelligence agencies had begun tracking him after security cameras captured his inexplicable interaction with the alien vessel. During one street performance, his guitar seemed to create localized quantum interference patterns that perfectly matched segments of the transmission. Government agents and quantum physicists alike were baffled. "We're not being invaded," Dr. Chen concluded after weeks of analysis. "We're being evaluated." The transmission continued to evolve. It was a test, a communication, and something far more complex, a living system that seemed to be actively engaging with human consciousness. Each attempt to understand it revealed new layers of complexity, like an infinite puzzle that reconstructed itself with every observation. Priya Merchant's collaborative platform had become more than a decryption tool. It was now a global consciousness network, with participants from every continent working in real time to understand the impossible transmission. Teenagers, retired scientists, indigenous knowledge keepers, and professional researchers worked side by side, breaking down traditional barriers of expertise and nationality. As the world watched and worked, one thing became increasingly clear: this was no ordinary first contact. The alien transmission was changing humanity, transforming how they thought about communication, intelligence, and their place in the universe. The impossible had become possible, and humanity was just beginning to understand the invitation. The Amazon rainforest had always been a repository of secrets, but nothing could have prepared the world for what emerged from the small Yanomami community deep in the heart of the Brazilian wilderness. Alina Kopanoa, a 67-year-old indigenous knowledge keeper, stood before an international panel of scientists, her weathered hands holding a set of intricate string patterns, a traditional communication method used by her people for generations. What she revealed would reshape humanity's understanding of the alien transmission. "The pattern is not just a message," Alina explained, her voice steady and profound. "It is a living conversation." The string patterns, complex macrame-like structures that looked like a hybrid between mathematical equations and ecological diagrams, perfectly correlated with specific segments of the alien transmission. Dr. Arya Chen's quantum linguistics team confirmed what seemed impossible. The Yanomami's traditional knowledge contained communication principles that matched the alien signal's most complex components. Simultaneously, in a crowded server farm in Mumbai, Priya Merchant's collaborative platform had transformed into something far beyond its original design. What started as a high school coding project now represented the most sophisticated collective intelligence network in human history. Participants from 192 countries worked in real time, their individual contributions forming a global neural network that was slowly decoding the alien invitation. Jack Rodriguez discovered he was more than just a coincidental participant. During a live-streamed street performance, his guitar began to generate quantum interference patterns that directly corresponded with the transmission. Scientific instruments tracked impossible resonances, sound waves that simultaneously existed in multiple quantum states, bridging musical composition and advanced communication technology. The global response was unlike anything in human history. This wasn't about military preparedness or technological superiority. It was a collective problem-solving effort that transcended national boundaries, cultural differences, and traditional expertise. In Geneva, a team of climate engineers found that the transmission contained complex ecological adaptation algorithms. In Nairobi, computer scientists discovered mathematical sequences that suggested advanced biomimicry principles. A group of retired mathematicians in St. Petersburg decoded quantum entanglement patterns that challenged fundamental understanding of physics. Dr. Chen realized the aliens were not simply sending a message, they were conducting a comprehensive evaluation of humanity's collective intelligence and adaptive capabilities. The United Nations established the Global Response Coordination Center, an unprecedented collaboration that brought together experts from every conceivable field. Quantum physicists worked alongside indigenous knowledge keepers. Teenage programmers collaborated with retired diplomats. The traditional hierarchies of expertise dissolved in the face of this collective challenge. Elena Kopanowa's revelation about the Yanomami string patterns opened an entirely new avenue of investigation. Traditional knowledge systems, long marginalized by Western scientific approaches, were now at the forefront of understanding the alien transmission. We are being asked a question, Dr. Chen explained during a global broadcast, and that question is more complex than any language can describe. It's about how we think, how we adapt, how we solve problems together. Priya Merchant watched in awe as her collaborative platform processed billions of calculations per second. What had begun as a school project was now the primary global interface for decoding the most significant communication in human history. Jack Rodriguez continued to play, his music now a critical component of scientific research. Each chord, each harmonic progression seemed to unlock new layers of the transmission's complexity. The world was no longer waiting for first contact. First contact was happening, and humanity was collectively rising to meet the challenge. The global crucible was heating up, and nobody knew exactly what would emerge. The first quantum anomaly struck London at precisely 3:42 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Gravity wavered. For 3 impossible minutes, objects in a 12-block radius began to float, spin, and behave in ways that defied every known physical law. A double-decker bus hovered 3 feet above the ground, its passengers suspended in midair with expressions of pure astonishment. Pigeons traced impossible helical patterns through the sky. Street signs twisted into fractal configurations. Dr. Arya Chen watched the live feed from the International Quantum Research Center, her hands trembling slightly as she realized the alien transmission was no longer just a communication. It was a fundamental restructuring of physical reality. Jack Rodriguez was performing near Trafalgar Square when it happened. His guitar, now a modified quantum sensing instrument, began to emit a sound that was simultaneously music and mathematical equation. The instruments surrounding him, scientific sensors hastily retrofitted to his equipment, went wild, tracking quantum signatures that should have been impossible. "It's responding to us," Jack muttered, his fingers moving across the guitar strings with an intuition he couldn't explain. "We're not just receiving. We're participating." Priya Merchant's collaborative platform transformed into something far beyond a decryption tool. As the quantum anomaly spread, Similar events occurred in Tokyo, Sao Paulo, and Cairo. Her network became a real-time global monitoring system. Millions of volunteers tracked, recorded, and attempted to understand the impossible physical transformations. The scientific community was both terrified and exhilarated. These weren't random disruptions. Each quantum event followed a precise, almost musical mathematical sequence. Gravity would fluctuate in harmonic patterns. Time would briefly stutter, creating localized moments where past, present, and future seemed to coexist. In the Amazon, Elena Kopenauer recognized something her ancestors had known for generations. "This is not destruction," she told a group of bewildered scientists. "This is communication. The universe is speaking to us." Dr. Chen's team discovered that the quantum anomalies were adaptive. They changed based on human observation, response, and collective emotional state. During moments of global calm and collaborative thinking, the anomalies became more stable. When fear or conflict emerged, the quantum disruptions became more chaotic. The most shocking discovery came from an unexpected source. A group of children in a Mumbai school noticed that group singing seemed to stabilize the local quantum field. Their impromptu musical performances created zones of quantum stability, where physical laws returned to normal. Jack Rodriguez's modified guitar became a critical research instrument. Scientists discovered that specific musical compositions could not only track, but potentially influence the quantum anomalies. His street performances were now live scientific experiments, broadcast globally, and analyzed in real time. "We're not just observing," Dr. Chen explained during a global broadcast. "We're participating in a form of communication more complex than any language we've ever known. The aliens are teaching us how to think differently about reality itself." Priya Merchant's platform began to show something extraordinary. The global network of volunteers wasn't just tracking the quantum anomalies. They were learning to predict and potentially influence them. Machine learning algorithms developed by teenagers worked alongside quantum physicists, creating predictive models that challenged everything known about physical reality. The quantum convergence was more than a scientific event. It was a collective human experience that was reshaping understanding of consciousness, communication, and the fundamental nature of reality. As the world watched and participated, one thing became clear: this was no ordinary first contact. Humanity was being invited to reimagine everything it thought it knew about the universe. And they were rising to the challenge. The next phase of the alien transmission arrived not through scientific instruments, but through human emotion. It began in a refugee camp on the border of Sudan and South Sudan, where survivors of decades-long conflicts experienced something unprecedented. Fatima Adel, a 42-year-old woman who had lost her entire family to war, found herself suddenly connected to a collective narrative that transcended her individual pain. The transmission wasn't a visual or auditory message. It was a profound emotional experience, a living tapestry of stories from across the galaxy. Refugees, trauma survivors, and individuals who had endured unimaginable hardships became the unexpected interpreters of this new communication. Dr. Arya Chen watched in astonishment as her team's most advanced quantum linguistics algorithms were rendered obsolete. The alien communication was revealing itself to be something far more complex than a language. It was a method of sharing lived experiences across species and civilizations. Jack Rodriguez discovered his music had transformed. When he played, the compositions were no longer just sound, but carriers of emotional information. Each chord became a conduit for narratives of survival, transformation, and collective healing. Street performances in New York became impromptu healing sessions, with audiences experiencing shared emotional journeys that defied explanation. Priya Merchant's collaborative platform evolved into something far beyond a communication network. It became a global empathy engine, capturing and processing emotional data in ways no previous technology had achieved. Participants weren't just sharing information, they were sharing experiences, memories, and collective consciousness. In the Amazon, Elena Kopenauer recognized this as something her indigenous traditions had always understood. "We have always known," she told a gathering of global leaders, "that true communication is not about words. It is about feeling." The scientific community struggled to comprehend the new protocol. Traditional measures of intelligence gave way to more nuanced understandings of consciousness. Emotional intelligence became the primary metric of human potential. Unexpected heroes emerged. A group of child psychologists in Toronto discovered that children who had experienced complex trauma were particularly adept at interpreting the alien transmission. Their ability to process multiple layers of emotional experience made them uniquely qualified to understand this new form of communication. Dr. Chen's team identified what they called the empathy cascade, a phenomenon where shared emotional experiences could create localized quantum stabilization. Regions with high levels of collective empathy experienced fewer quantum anomalies. Areas of conflict and emotional disconnection saw more severe disruptions. Jack Rodriguez's performances became critical research events. Scientists discovered that his music could create emotional resonance fields that seemed to communicate with the alien transmission. Each performance was carefully mapped, with quantum sensors tracking the emotional responses of the audience. The global response was unprecedented. Mental health resources were redirected. Educational systems began to prioritize emotional intelligence and collective problem-solving. The very definition of human potential was being rewritten. Priya Merchant watched as her platform processed billions of emotional data points. What had begun as a simple coding project was now the most sophisticated empathy mapping system in human history. Teenagers from around the world collaborated to understand the emotional layers of the alien communication. "We are being asked to understand," Dr. Chen explained during a global broadcast, "not just with our minds, but with our entire being. This is a test of our capacity for collective empathy." The alien transmission was revealing humanity's true potential, not as a technological species, but as a civilization capable of profound emotional connection and collective understanding. As the world watched and participated, one thing became clear: this was no ordinary first contact. Humanity was being invited to reimagine what it meant to truly communicate. The moment humanity crossed the threshold arrived without fanfare, in a symphony of collective creativity that spanned the entire planet. It began in the most unexpected places. A street artist in Buenos Aires painted a mural that simultaneously appeared, with microscopic variations, in Tokyo, Lagos, and Moscow. A musical composition created by an international ensemble of musicians, each member in a different country, became a living, evolving piece that seemed to breathe with its own consciousness. Dr. Arya Chen watched from the International Quantum Research Center as the alien transmission transformed from a test into something far more profound. The communication was no longer just receiving, it was co-creating. Jack Rodriguez stood at the center of a global performance that defied traditional understanding of music. His guitar, now a quantum instrument of unprecedented complexity, connected musicians across 6 continents. When he played, the sound wasn't just heard. It was felt, seen, and experienced as a multidimensional phenomenon. Priya Merchant's collaborative platform had become something beyond a communication network. It was a global consciousness engine, processing creativity, emotion, and collective intelligence in real time. Millions of participants were no longer just decoding the alien transmission. They were actively participating in its creation. The artistic response became the primary language of communication. Traditional diplomatic channels fell silent as painters, musicians, writers, and performers became the primary interpreters of the alien invitation. Elena Kopanoa, the indigenous knowledge keeper, explained it most clearly. Art is the language of consciousness. We are being asked to speak our truth. Scientific instruments tracked something extraordinary. The creative outputs from around the world began to show microscopic but consistent patterns, a global synchronicity that suggested a deeper, more fundamental form of communication. Paintings created thousands of miles apart would share impossible geometric similarities. Musical compositions would contain identical mathematical sequences in their underlying structure. Dr. Chen's team discovered that the creative expressions were actually solving complex problems. A dance performance in New Delhi would contain the solution to a quantum physics challenge. A poem written by a teenager in Vancouver would provide insights into ecological restoration that had stumped scientists for decades. The alien transmission had become a collaborative creation, a living, breathing system of mutual understanding that transcended traditional boundaries of communication. Jack Rodriguez's performances became global events. During one live-streamed concert, his music generated quantum resonance patterns that stabilized local atmospheric conditions. Cities experiencing the performance saw reduced seismic activity, normalized weather patterns, and increased levels of collective well-being. Priya Merchant watched as her platform processed the creative outputs. What had begun as a simple collaborative tool was now the most sophisticated consciousness mapping system in human history. The platform could predict emerging global creative trends with impossible accuracy, revealing underlying patterns of human potential. The resonance threshold was more than a scientific milestone. It was a moment of collective awakening. World leaders found themselves increasingly irrelevant. The global response to the alien transmission was happening through art, music, scientific collaboration, and collective creativity. National boundaries became increasingly meaningless as humanity spoke with a unified voice. "We are being invited to become something more," Dr. Chen explained during a global broadcast that was simultaneously a scientific report, an artistic performance, and a moment of collective reflection. This is not first contact. This is co-creation. As the world watched and participated, the boundary between observation and creation blurred. Humanity was no longer just responding to an alien invitation. They were writing the next chapter of their existence together. The resonance threshold had been crossed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The final challenge emerged like a living algorithm, spreading across the planet with the speed of thought and the complexity of a multidimensional puzzle. Dr. Arya Chen stood in the International Quantum Research Center, watching as humanity's collective potential unfolded in ways no one could have predicted. The alien transmission had transformed from a test to a collaborative transformation, challenging every fundamental understanding of intelligence, communication, and possibility. Jack Rodriguez's guitar, now a quantum instrument that defied traditional physics, became the unexpected conductor of a global symphony of problem-solving. When he played, solutions emerged from the most unlikely sources. A homeless musician in Rio de Janeiro would suddenly contribute a breakthrough in climate restoration. A retired teacher in Nairobi would solve a complex quantum entanglement problem through a seemingly simple melody. Priya Merchant's collaborative platform had become something far beyond a communication network. It was a living, breathing global consciousness engine that processed creativity, scientific insight, and collective intelligence with impossible precision. Millions of participants were no longer just solving a challenge, they were redefining the very concept of problem-solving. The challenge presented by the alien transmission was simultaneously technological, ecological, philosophical, and deeply personal. It required a level of collective thinking that transcended individual expertise, national boundaries, and traditional understanding of intelligence. In the Amazon rainforest, Elena Kopanow connected indigenous knowledge systems with cutting-edge quantum research. Her community's traditional ecological understanding provided critical insights that scientific methodologies had overlooked. Ancient wisdom and quantum physics danced together, revealing solutions that no single approach could have discovered. Scientific instruments tracked an unprecedented phenomenon. As humanity worked collectively, localized quantum stabilization occurred. Cities experiencing high levels of collaborative problem-solving saw reduced environmental stress, normalized weather patterns, and increased levels of collective well-being. Dr. Chen's team discovered that the most effective solutions emerged from the most diverse teams. A group of teenage programmers in Mumbai would collaborate with retired engineers in Moscow, indigenous knowledge keepers in Australia, and quantum physicists in Geneva. Each solution was a tapestry of different perspectives, woven together with unprecedented complexity. Jack Rodriguez's performances became more than music. They were living problem-solving interfaces. During one global broadcast, his guitar generated quantum resonance patterns that helped teams around the world visualize complex systemic challenges. Mathematical equations would appear in the air. Collaborative solutions would emerge in real time, bridging disciplines and cultural perspectives. Priya Merchant watched in awe as her platform processed the collective intelligence. What had begun as a simple collaborative tool was now mapping human potential in ways no one could have imagined. The platform could predict emerging solutions, highlight interconnected challenges, and facilitate unprecedented levels of global cooperation. The crucible was heating up. Humanity was being asked to solve challenges that went far beyond technological or ecological problems. This was a test of collective consciousness, of the ability to think and act as a unified, adaptive system. Unexpected heroes emerged everywhere. A group of children in a refugee camp would provide the critical emotional intelligence needed to solve a complex diplomatic challenge. A community of artists would develop a communication protocol that would revolutionize global understanding. We are being asked to become something more, Dr. Chen explained during a global broadcast that was simultaneously a scientific report, an artistic performance, and a moment of collective reflection. This is not just about solving a problem. This is about understanding our collective potential. As the world watched and participated, the boundary between individual and collective intelligence dissolved. Humanity was no longer just responding to a challenge. They were rewriting the very definition of intelligence, creativity, and possibility. The crucible of potential was burning bright, and nothing would ever be the same again. The final revelation came not with a thunderous declaration, but with a quiet, profound transformation that swept across the planet like a gentle wave of understanding. Dr. Arya Chen stood at the window of the International Quantum Research Center, watching as the 17 alien vessels began to subtly change. They were no longer static structures but living, breathing entities that seemed to pulse with the collective consciousness of humanity. Jack Rodriguez played his final performance, a composition that was simultaneously music, mathematical equation, and emotional landscape. His guitar, now a quantum instrument of unprecedented complexity, translated the collective experience of humanity into a language that transcended sound and vision. Priya Merchant's collaborative platform had become something beyond human comprehension. It was a living network of global consciousness, processing the collective intelligence of millions with an intricacy that blurred the lines between technology and sentience. The aliens had not come to conquer. They had not come to teach. They had come to witness humanity's potential for transformation. Belina Kopanoa, the indigenous knowledge keeper, understood this most clearly. We were never being tested, she explained to a gathering of global leaders and scientists. We were being invited to recognize our own potential. The 17 vessels began to dissolve, not as a departure, but as a merging. Their quantum signatures integrated with the collective human consciousness, creating a network of understanding that spanned the galaxy. It was a graduation of sorts. Humanity was no longer an isolated species, but a potential seed civilization with the capacity to understand and connect at a fundamental level. Dr. Chen's team discovered that the entire process had been a complex form of mutual recognition. The alien transmission was not a one-way communication, but a dialogue that had been happening on levels beyond traditional understanding. Humanity had been simultaneously the observer and the observed, the student and the teacher. Jack Rodriguez's music had become the bridge between human experience and galactic consciousness. His performances were now understood as more than artistic expressions. They were complex communication protocols that could translate emotional and intellectual experiences across species and dimensional boundaries. Priya Merchant watched as her platform transformed into something that could only be described as a living consciousness network. The boundaries between individual and collective intelligence had dissolved completely. Humanity was now a unified, adaptive system capable of solving challenges that spanned galaxies. The changes were profound and subtle. Cities redesigned themselves to be more collaborative. Educational systems focused on collective problem-solving and emotional intelligence. The very concept of national boundaries began to dissolve, replaced by a more fluid understanding of human potential. "We are not alone," Dr. Chen explained during the final global broadcast. "But more importantly, we were never truly separate." The alien vessels completed their transformation, their quantum signatures now integrated into the global human consciousness. They were no longer external entities, but part of a larger, interconnected system of understanding. Unexpected connections emerged everywhere. A farmer in Kenya would suddenly understand quantum physics. A mathematician in Japan would have profound insights into ecological restoration. The separation between disciplines, between individuals, between species began to blur. The Lingua Kopanoa's wisdom became the guiding principle. Communication is not about speaking. It is about understanding. As the 17 vessels completed their final transformation, humanity looked to the stars not with fear, but with a profound sense of possibility. They were no longer just inhabitants of a small planet in a vast universe. They were potential catalysts of understanding, bridges between different forms of consciousness. The invitation had never been about first contact. It had always been about mutual recognition, and humanity had answered.